Then henceforth, I am a law professor at Howard University School of Law, the director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, and perhaps most importantly, an alumnus of Georgetown University Law Center. I'm so happy to see some of my professors, Professor Edelman, of course, Dean back there, um, Dean Bellamy. So wonderful to have this conversation. And I was also a student of Emma Coleman Jordan, whose textbook on economic justice was one of the foundational elements of my education on the issue. So this is the perfect place to have this conversation. And I just would love to start off with just a brief reminder of why we are here. It is so important for us to understand, especially coming after the presentation we just watched, that we are at a turning point in our history on the issue of racial justice and economic justice. Those are two issues that throughout American history have been intertwined. That's something that history has shown us. So as we move into a period post 2020, where people are in unprecedented ways seeking to address the racial wealth gap, I'm very happy that today we have a number of people here who are going to explore a diversity of approaches towards bridging the racial wealth gap. Myself, one of the things that I was able to do in 2020 was work to support the reparations program, which was passed by the city of Evanston in 2019, one of the first of its kind in American history. It was a program designed to remedy the effects of racialized zoning practices, which took place in the city of Evanston between the years of 1919 and 1969. The city itself engaged in an analysis which demonstrated that it was complicit in the redlining policies during that time period, and it committed to providing reparations to the tune of a $10 million fund, $25,000 in housing vouchers for each citizen that was eligible. The program passed City Council, and in March of 2021, funds were actually delivered. Now, you may have heard Evanston is now in the news for deciding only 3 days ago, I believe, that they are now going to go beyond the housing voucher portion of their program and explore direct cash payments as well. What we were able to do with the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center was provide legal support, including providing a legal analysis which demonstrated that this program did not necessarily run into 14th Amendment problems in the way that some may have been concerned that it would do. There was a law firm which wrote a letter arguing that this was, in a sense, reverse discrimination to provide reparations on the grounds of race. And they provided analogies to both affirmative action and to government contracting in the precedent that they used. But we argued that this was indeed a constitutional program. In particular, it was narrowly tailored to provide a remedy for specific harm, which was outlined by the city's report. I'm so happy to have more discussions about that. But so as we move from these constitutional discussions to the discussions we're going to have today, I'm going to forego the initial descriptions of biographies here and go right into the questions for the sake of time. I'm going to depend on the panelists to introduce themselves. I know they're more than capable of doing so. And starting with Brian Gilmore, who is a scholar in this area. I know that you've been studying for some time the case for reparations law clinics, specifically based on your scholarship regarding the connection between housing discrimination and the continuing wealth gap. And as you know, something I'm interested in as well. So can you share some of the insights you've gained from your research and some of your proposals on this topic of reparations and law clinics?
So thanks a lot for that introduction. I'm Brian Gilmore, native Washingtonian. Now I'm senior lecturer at University of Maryland, College Park, the Terps. And also spent 11 years as a law professor, clinical law professor, running a housing clinic at Michigan State University in East Lansing. And but my entry into housing was, of course, at the Neighborhood Legal Services Program, which used to be right down the street, as a tenant lawyer, and then also the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. And very proud of that experience that I had. I was able to stay in positions that I enjoyed and respected and taught me a lot. So, but as a so-called scholar, academic, I don't know if I qualify as such a thing, but I did get into studying an FHA program that had brought about the wealth gap that we have in the United States, the racial wealth gap. And I'll just read a short quote that kind of summarizes it. This is from an article, not mine, but it's from a guy, Keith Wilhite. He says, after World War II, the Federal Housing Authority, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the GI Bill, and private developers worked in tandem to codify whiteness as the predominant identity of the emergent suburban nation. Under the aegis of the federal government, suburban development propelled the advancement of the white middle class to an extent that no subsequent affirmative action program could ever hope to replicate. For, like, I would say, 16 years now, I have researched and went over documents and went over hearing documents and written 4 articles with people and on my own. The latest one, as Justin indicated, was a few years ago. It's called The Case for Reparations Clinic, Proposal for Investigation, Documentation, and Remediation of Historic Housing Discrimination through the Law School Model. And then my article basically is calling for law schools to take the restorative justice clinics that they've begun to develop and do it on the housing discrimination side and provide some advocacy, provide some legal guidance to advocates, and I mean, get right down to what the federal government is not doing. The only thing they really have asked the federal government to do, Congress to do, is create a commission to begin to study this, and they won't even do that. So I say the law schools probably have to be private law schools, at least in my article. I think private model is the best model to actually do something like this. The document, this is not like chattel slavery, where the records are kind of difficult. These records are available. The witnesses are available. The people who experienced this are available. The people who did this are available. Guy in Chicago, Dempsey Travis, was a Black real estate agent, and he just died in 2013, and he knows all. He knows where, as they say, the bodies are buried. He knew everything about what was done in Chicago, the Red Line, Chicago. And this happened in every city in the United States. So I would say the next development I see beyond that is we're now seeing that this is even more deep and more depraved than we thought, because now we're finding out that the real estate developers, the real estate players, the economists, the urban planners were connected to the eugenicists who were operating at the time, at the turn of the century. And they had a close relationship. And somehow our government hired these people to design our housing market in 1934, which is the mortgage market that we still know today, the 30-year mortgage market. These individuals designed it, and they designed it in the manner that I stated in that quote there. And there are more and more articles that are starting to appear showing this relationship. So it's not like the evidence is getting more elusive. The evidence is getting even better. In 1962, and I'm not going to take up too much of the time. In 1962, in Washington, D.C., the United States Civil Rights Commission held a 2-day hearing in Washington, D.C. to study housing discrimination in Washington, D.C., in the city of Washington, D.C., the metropolitan area. And it wasn't like people came in there and denied that these things happened. They came in and said that, yes, I work for FHA and this is what we were told to do. I'm a real estate appraiser. This is what I was told to do. I'm a banker and this is what I was told to do. I tried to purchase a house and this is what happened to me. So if you want to know why there's a wealth gap, the evidence is readily available. And in my article, what we are saying, me and my co-writer, Hannah D. Adams, were saying is the evidence is there. All you have to do is begin to marshal the evidence and make the case for, and then they talk Justin's big deal is, reparations. It could be reparations. That's not my argument to make, but maybe it's something else. I don't know. But that's what I see as the next step. I'm not saying my article is the next step, but something, a commission, something. We have to take the next step. Otherwise, will remain where we are. And as Townhouse coach, my good friend, we came up in D.C. together as poets. As he always says, otherwise you're just stuck with plunder. You're stuck with some people who have a lot of wealth and some people who have none, and that's a recipe for tension and more tension and racial strife, as we say. And I don't have enough time to explain that whole eugenics relationship, but that the articles have been written. The latest one was 2020 by Laura Lovett, who's a historian. So this will probably be the next article that I'll write about, is how the evidence is getting even clearer, getting better. And you wonder, like, of Franklin Roosevelt's great trust, those great men he hired, which one of them hired these people to design the mortgage program that did this to not just African Americans, but it did it to everybody. Because now this is in everybody's lap. When we have to deal with it. So as was said, Mr. Hamilton was saying on his talk there, as he was saying there, I mean, what are we going to do about this at this point? Well, I mean, because the difference is so profound that it calls out for some type of action. And my view is something, something there. So I'll pass it back to you.
All right, thank you for that. Very good. I have a number of follow-up questions, but I'm going to ask everyone a question first, and then we'll start more follow-ups. Next, we have Wilson Schooley, former chair of the ABA section on civil rights. You work to help micro businesses get lawyers. How and why does that work relate to our topic of racial justice and economics? And what are the challenges that you face in that regard?
Thanks, Justin, and good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here in this great group talking about this vital topic. Let me start by echoing what you heard over and over again, which is that racial and economic justice are like conjoined twins in our economy. They're inseparable. I think of them as the unholy marriage between racial and economic injustice, kind of a union conceived in our American disuse. As Ms. Arlene Carr noted yesterday at lunch, you can't deal with one without dealing with the other. The racist economic decisions and actions that impact Black Americans so pervasively that they affect everybody in this country, across racial lines. That predominant zero-sum notion that you can't, that economic progress for people of color somehow comes at white expense is just wrong, just flat wrong. And there's tons of evidence that shows that. I don't want to talk too long, so I'm just going to cut some of what I was going to say out. But I really appreciated the way this program, first of all, thanks to Juan for initiating it, but I appreciated the way it was kicked off by Congressman Green when he referenced August 1619. And he discussed commemoration and remembrance and even a Department of Reconciliation and the importance of reparation, because that's where we have to start. I think white Americans typically see slavery as an aberration, as an exception to American exceptionalism, when the reality is that its central role in our economy and our country is undeniable and enduring. The taint of slavery's torture and blood money is on every single white American's inherited wealth. And people I don't think fully understand that. The Black Americans were forced to build an economy from which they've been systematically excluded. And the result is that despite their mighty contribution to building that economy, Black wealth today is less than 10% of white wealth. And it just went on. After slavery, the disinvestment in infrastructure and housing in particular continued during Jim Crow and beyond. And the New Deal social contract was filtered through racism, segregation, further diminishing that intergenerational wealth building that's so vital to our survival. People. In fact, from the New Deal through the Civil Rights Movement, intergenerational wealth was built by public policy that was very explicit about trying to create a secure middle class, and just as explicit as in ensuring that only white people got those benefits. It was right there in the letter of the law. So that's the macro historical and pervasive systemic context. This egregiously disparate wealth and its long and consciously and consistently cultivated roots, so that the whole history of America follows the bloody trail of Black people change. On the micro level, a little bit about what I try to do in a tiny way every day, and how that works so closely and interacts so much in my daily work with this history we've just been talking about. About a year and a half ago, I accepted an invitation to join a public service nonprofit law firm, specifically to run a program that they called the Micro Business and Nonprofit Support Program. That's a really banal title that bugs me every time I have to say it. But that's what it's called, and I joined it to do that. I took that role specifically because it presented an opportunity to work on the racial wealth. How did I get to do that? Well, Professor Derek Hamilton just made reference to entrepreneurship. So nominally, what I do every day is I help entrepreneurs and micro businesses in low-income, marginalized, depressed communities try to get ahead, try to get a leg up, try to get the help they need, the legal help that they need to start a business, the legal help that they need but cannot possibly afford. All my clients are low income. Big surprise. As it turns out, the vast majority of them are people of color. So I see up close and personal every single day the effect of all these macro economic forces that we've been talking about this morning and yesterday. And I go out and I provide big firm lawyers who normally charge hundreds of thousands of dollars an hour to these folks for free. There's two challenges that this work presents. One of them is daunting but rewarding. The other one is frustrating. But the daunting but rewarding one is, and both of them, involve me every day with these issues that we're talking about, and show the inseparability of race and money. So the first and daunting but rewarding one is I help folks who have had little to no opportunity get a leg up, so that they can at least begin trying to start to build wealth for their family, generational wealth. The second part that I do is I try to help my volunteer lawyers understand their client and their client's needs and their client's history. And that's the frustrating part. Because I have to spend so much time doing that just to get them to a point where they can be effective in helping these clients. Most of these lawyers, like most white Americans, still see slavery as an aberration, as an exception to our dominant notion of liberty and justice in America. And they think of it as old history, and it just doesn't enter their consciousness as much as, and I'm talking about, these are good people. The fact is that's not the case. Slavery and all the subsequent oppression for the last 400 years were integral to the construction of our modern economy. So I start my work by trying to instill in these lawyers a fundamental skepticism of mainstream white narrative about our history that credits America's wealth and dominance in the world to white brothers, when in fact, so much of that wealth is a product of black labor, ingenuity, and torture of black Americans, who were then systematically excluded from its reward. So when Dorothy Brown's comments last night resonated so much with me about how to make reparations possible by making people understand our true American history and why the current efforts that we see every day now to erase even further that history are so abhorrent. We Americans, all Americans, people of all colors, learned very early to internalize the notion that white people have more because they are more. People of color have less because they are less. And I see it every day in the lawyers who volunteer to help my clients. These are good people. These are people who have good hearts and good intentions and are trying to do good work. And they nonetheless cannot help seeing my clients as people whose struggles are their own fault, of their own making. And they start there. And even after I talk to them, sometimes they don't see the light. But I start my orientation of them much with what Congressman Green, Ms. Parr yesterday at lunch, Professor Brown talked about, starting with slavery. You know, cotton was the most important commodity in the global economy in the 1800s. It was the key to launching the global economy the way it was. And enslaved black labor was the driving force that created that global economy. W.B. Du Bois wrote about that. Many people have, including Edward Baptiste, whose book, Half It Has Not Been Told. Yet again, despite all of that, despite black Americans being the heart of what built that economy, today black American wealth is 8% of white wealth. And by wealth, I mean simply the difference between what we own and what we owe. Nothing, not big money, just simple things that allow us to put our kids through school and buy a house and even have access to the public policy, to governmental change. So the median wealth of black households is $14,100. The median wealth of white households, $187,300. The typical black household has 8% of what the typical black household has. Compared to whites, black Americans are twice as likely to be unemployed and make 25% less money when they are employed. Those statistics are so egregious and stark. It feels impossible that we're not doing more every day to change it. But they're not just statistics. They're the people that I work with every day. So I see how real and painful and racial are these disparities. And as Professor Gilmore or Brian was saying just a minute ago, every day we discover new ways in which this insidious racism was practiced and still is practiced. You can't stop discovering the horror. And it's all the more painful because, as Professor Barr said and Professor Brown said, this gap is no accident. The result of slavery followed by, 4 centuries of oppression. Federal and state policies that systematically facilitate the deprivation of black Americans from torture and terror during slavery, followed by not only complete absence of reparations to black Americans, but reparations to white slaveholders. That's where we gave reparations. And then the systematic oppression of Jim Crow, the New Deal redlining, the tax policies Dorothy Brown was talking about last night, to the institutionalized racism we see today that manifests in so many disparate access to jobs and houses, healthcare, criminal justice system, all government policy created, building, preventing this passing on of wealth among black Americans. I have an added advantage in explaining some of this history because I spent decades defending indigent accused in criminal matters. So I was firsthand, had my foot and hand and face up against the incredibly massive racist policing incarceration complex that our country has built, where we have about 13% of Black population in this country, and almost 40% of the people in prison are Black. And that's just another piece of that puzzle, of that same puzzle we've been talking. And just add that and this is probably no surprise, but the racial wealth gap widened in the last few years with the pandemic and the recession that followed. So that now, you know, the laughable notion of post-racial, the racial wealth gap is about what it was in the 1950s. And here we are, all these years later. Why Congressman Green's remarks resonate so much. Why it's so important to understand, like Dorothy Brown said last night, the 4-century continuum, craven oppression that Black families have to deal with every single minute of every single day. The undeniable reality that Black Americans were forced to build a country from which they have been systematically excluded from participating. Black folks have a 400-year history on this soil. 245 of those years were in slavery. 100 of those years were under legalized oppression. And the little bit that's left is we're in this abyss of not even recognizing the wrong that was done, much less correcting. So it's so imperative to our living up to the notions that we espouse, that we work every way and every day to overcome this incredible disparity and oppression that creates the wealth gap that people are suffering in today, just as they were in 1950. So I'm so grateful that we are all talking about this here, and that you are all here listening to us, and that these wonderful colleagues are adding to the conversation.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And last but not least, we have Professor Carrie Shelby from Washington and Lee. Very happy to see that you have a presentation. We've talked about entrepreneurship and reparations as pathways to describing ways to bridge this huge racial wealth gap in our economy. Now we're going to talk about another lens to discuss this issue from a systemic level, which is always an important lens. And in particular, you wrote a paper entitled Racism and Systemic Risk, as we can see there on the screen. So, and you make a claim in this article, which is novel, that racism itself is a threat to our financial stability, for our economy. So maybe you could explain for us some of the main ideas in your project and how it's relevant to this question of bridging the racial wealth gap and creating economic justice.
Thank you. Thank you so much for allowing me to be in this sacred space. On a personal note, many of the topics discussed over these 2 days relate to my own lived experiences as an individual who has experienced foster care as a youth, homelessness, poverty, single parenthood. And my 20-year-old son is in the audience. And and Junior at Howard, by the way.
Oh, okay.
It's
you.
Had to give the shout out.
All right.
All while, right? So I experienced these lived experiences all while receiving things such as a link card, free medical care, a free college education as a recipient of the Youth in College program as a former ward of the state in Illinois. And so I have to give a shout out to all of the individuals and organizations in this room who were a major part of my own personal mosaic of success. However, I have to be honest with you in that my lived experiences initially pushed me away from this kind of work, and that I was really wanting to build an identity that was separate and distinct from my trauma. So I spent the earlier part of my academic career primarily researching the increasing publicness of hedge funds. I was a hedge fund attorney for 4 years. I'm a corporate and securities law scholar. And I highlighted how the fact that Hedge funds are available to the general public. Hedge funds can generate systemic risk. So perhaps the law should do more to regulate these private vehicles. However, as you can anticipate, my lived experience was always percolating at the backdrop of my identity as an educator and as an investment fund scholar. I started to see the ways in which the social impact investing industry, which primarily operates in the private realm, was excluded to elite investors and institutional investors, thereby not including the targeted community members in which they were intending to help as investors, managers, or any sort of meaningful voice at all. That brings me to my current topic of the day. My research has now expanded to investigate the ways in which the regulatory apparatus under corporate and securities laws, filtered through a critical race theory lens, can be used as a mechanism to protect against more expansive notions of systemic risk that arise from racist policies and practices. So, next slide. There we go. So, forgive me, I am attempting to squeeze a massive amount of information within a very short period of time. But the thesis of my article is that FSOC, which is the Financial Stability Oversight Council, should recognize racism as a threat to financial stability due to its interconnectedness with recent and projected systemic risk events. I endeavor to define racism in the paper, which I won't do here, but I make it a point that my vision of racism encompasses systemic racism, which is essential in identifying the ways in which the private sector exploits underrepresented communities, which eventually leads to the systemic threats that I will talk about later. What is systemic risk? This is fundamentally different than systemic racism. The CFA Institute describes systemic risk as the risk of a breakdown of an entire system rather than the failure of its individual parts. And this term became really popular as a result of the financial crisis of 07 to 09, which I define as the Great Recession, in that the failure of Lehman, as you may recall, led to cascading failures across the financial system. However, what was unique about the crisis is that it revealed loopholes in our regulatory design in terms of protecting against this kind of systemic risk, and that it wasn't just banking industries that were creating this kind of risk. And our regulatory design is extremely bifurcated, where you have the SEC that regulates securities, the CFTC regulates futures, you have a separate agency regulating banks. And so part of the solution under the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, which is this massive piece of legislation, was to create this super regulator, FSOC. FSOC is comprised of 15 member agencies, and the goal is that, my goodness, by bringing all of these agencies together in this way, they could better mitigate against emerging threats to the economy. So most recently, in 2021, FSOC recognized climate change as a threat to financial stability. And so this was huge, and that climate change was historically viewed as a social justice issue. But wow, wait a minute, even though, as we discussed in our prior panel, underrepresented communities and Black communities have been experiencing these dystopian realities across centuries, now the broader economy is starting to suffer, right? The insurance industry will face financial losses due to increasing premiums, tourism industries, farming industries, fishery industries. And so this was a pretty big deal. So I use this recognition as a blueprint to advocate that FSOC similarly recognize racism as a threat to financial stability. So that brings us to my next slide. Fantastic. And so what precisely is the connection between racism and systemic risk? I've been having this conversation over the course of these 2 days. I tried to answer this question through this model which provides a visual depiction of how racism drives every stage along the life cycle continuum of a systemic risk disruption. In more direct terms, I am seeking to demonstrate the ways in which all of the disparate harms that we have been discussing across these 2 days, related to climate change, for example, the lack of affordable housing, how do these disparate harms spill over into the general economy, thereby threatening financial stability? So in the paper, I utilized the Great Recession as a case study, and I also utilized climate change as a case study, since climate change was recently recognized as a systemic threat to the economy. But for purposes of today's presentation, I will focus on the Great Recession. So if you look at the first column, I make the argument that racism, in this introduction phase of systemic risk, racist practice and policies incentivize systemic risk by transforming Black communities and other underrepresented communities into ideal dumping grounds for the negative externalities produced by the private sector. So how precisely does this happen from a legal and economic standpoint? We know this in this room, from what I can gather. In dissecting this claim with respect to this component of the model, I first assess the scale and the depth of the disparate harms. And so in thinking about the Great Recession, for example, the subprime mortgage crisis, which was a major contributor to that crisis. But as we all know within this room, Black communities and other underrepresented communities were disproportionately targeted for these loans. And so in the paper, I spent a lot of time gathering data in that regard and really dissecting the predatory lending practices that happened during this time period. Secondly, I assessed the extent to which pre-existing vulnerabilities from a legal standpoint in particular lead to exploitation of this magnitude. So this connects us to our prior panel on redlining, for example. And so these historical practices of redlining and racial restrictive covenants made our communities the perfect breeding ground to be targeted in this way, in that they had a need for mortgages, right? Many individuals within our communities face discrimination in securing mortgages. And so even a high number of Black individuals and families who would have qualified for the higher quality prime mortgages were oftentimes steered to the lower quality subprime mortgages. And so last but not least, I then assessed the extent to which the law, under its current framework, includes limited legal protections in preventing these disparate impacts from occurring in the first place. And so with respect to the fallout and the crisis, we saw, like, my goodness, who was held liable for these harms? Many institutions that participated in predatory lending were deemed too big to fail. The legal frameworks made it very difficult to attach liability to a particular individual within an organization. There were some settlements, but there was no direct admission of wrongdoing. And so I argue that, my goodness, perhaps this incentivizes the private sector to participate in these harms because they face limited legal repercussions for doing so. That brings me to the second column. Forgive me for going so fast, we don't have a lot of time. So once these disparate harms are allowed to freely exist, with minimal legal interventions to prevent them from happening, I argue that the financial sector further commodifies these harms, which causes the systemic risk to grow within this period. So with respect to the Great Recession, the financial sector repackaged subprime mortgages into complicated derivatives, sold them to institutions across the globe. So now you have a scenario, and this is perhaps the most important component of this model, where the financial sector has thought of a way to spread those harms to the broader economy. And what's unique about these markets, and this brings us to our topic on wealth inequality, is that the same communities that were targeted for subprime mortgages were not permitted to participate in these markets under federal securities laws, for example, right? And that these were private markets because they were deemed too risky, right? And so the same communities that were exposed to these mortgages weren't allowed to build their wealth during this time period. I also argue in that, wow, because these markets are exclusive in this way, perhaps this muddles the risk reward calculation. If you're not suffering the same disparate impacts, then perhaps it makes it easier to participate in those markets and grow those markets. And I think this is easier to envision in thinking about climate change. So in looking at the middle, or not the middle, the third column, this maturity phase, I argue that racism extends the depth and duration of the maturity phase of a systemic risk disruption. In thinking about the Great Recession, for example, I utilize Derek Bell's interest convergence theory to argue that we don't really see direct regulatory relief until the entire economy is suffering harms. This is when the systemic disruption reaches the apex level. So yes, at this juncture, we see regulatory relief. However, due to racism, that relief is tilted in favor, I argue, to elite individuals and parties. That extends this maturity phase. Maybe we could have ended this earlier, right? And so I gather a lot of data in the paper where I compare the relief that was granted to institutions, for example, to the relief that was granted to individuals who lost their homes, for example, lost their jobs, who needed to access the social safety net. It was minimal, right? And so in looking at the decline, right, this is where the interests no longer converge, the institutions have been bailed out. What about the long-term harms to underrepresented communities and thinking about the lack of housing, unemployment, the complete decimation to wealth? Racism also elongates this decline phase because it's very difficult within this phase where the interests are no longer aligned for our communities to get the sort of help they need in order to resolve these long-term harms. Where does that bring us? So that last arrow, that arrow at the bottom of the slide, I argue this serves to increase the vulnerabilities of our communities, thereby repeating the cycle again, perhaps in perpetuity, because again, increasing the vulnerabilities of our communities is actually quite profitable for the private sector in terms of dumping those negative externalities onto our communities. So my goodness, we talked about, you mentioned how the wealth gap is even worse. Now it's, in thinking about climate change as a separate systemic disruption, it's cheaper to build a plant within our communities from an economic perspective, and they face limited legal repercussions for doing so. So you can envision other potential systemic risk disruptions that could flow through this model. So I end my paper by talking about how COVID-19 as a systemic disruption could perhaps be filtered through at least a few components of this model. So that brings me to the last slide, which I will talk about in 2 seconds. Oh, I ate up a lot of time. I'm so sorry. Okay,
No, you're fine, you're
my
fine.
solution. Financial stability, I argue that the Financial Stability Oversight Council should recognize racism as a threat to financial stability in the same way that they have recognized climate change as a threat to financial stability. This perhaps wasn't the best slide to include. There are too many words on this slide, but I see about 3 potential benefits of a recognition of this magnitude. Number one, it could call for coordination and expertise building and data gathering across all regulatory agencies, not just a single regulatory agency. It could spur regulatory action. So for example, the SEC could perhaps consider in response to a recognition of this magnitude, developing a mandatory disclosure framework for private companies or registered companies that details the extent to which they are harming communities, right? And so I could talk a lot more about how a framework like that would look, but I firmly believe that holding our current regulatory system accountable to its mission of identifying emerging threats is really, really important. So I will leave it there, and I am looking forward to your questions and comments.
All right, thank you. Yeah, looking forward to the discussion. I know we're very short on time. I'll take moderator's privilege and ask one open question. I know that our three presentations here, reparations, entrepreneurship, and regulatory oversight, three different approaches towards bridging the wealth gap, certainly are based on divergent viewpoints in terms of intervention in the economy. We know that there's the free market view that we should be incentivizing entrepreneurship and have a hands-off approach. You have a regulatory view here in terms of regulating financial markets, and then you have reparations, which many see as a intervention which, similar to the bailout, it's one that may not be based on some people's view, some justification. I think our critical race theory discussion is one of the ways in which people fail to see the justifications for it. So people see it as unjustified interventions. But I guess what my question, it's a roundabout way of asking a question. My question is basically, what do you think is the most likely approach and the most likely to be successful approach? The most. I know you have your three different analyses, but what do you think is most likely to be the thing that really happens and really is going to make a difference? People have argued that reparations, for example, on the local level, will never do enough to change the national economy, and we're very unlikely to see it on a national level. Mostly local governments that are interested in that. Entrepreneurship is a person by person enterprise, and those entrepreneurs don't always spread their wealth once they obtain it. They buy their own yachts and move, go along their merry way. And in terms of the oversight of the financial markets, will disclosure really change that incentive structure? Because as you said, with the interest convergence dilemma being what it is, it will still be more profitable for these financial securities entities to dump assets into the Black community that are unwanted or to exploit those problems. So even if they disclose, the profit structure is actually not changed. It's simply a disclosure of how poorly they're acting. So that's laying a lot on you. So I criticize each of your proposals basically, but I know there's a lot that there's there. But my real question is, what is the most likely to be successful, do you think? Reparations, oversight, entrepreneurship. Yep.
I think that I guess I'm an Afro optimist as opposed to an Afro pessimist. I actually think that eventually the United States will do something like a commission or something like that to begin to study this. They've awarded reparations before. Not kid ourselves. Native Americans, Japanese Americans receive reparations, but also believe in the short term. I think that's the long-term thing. I don't believe the United States will come to that, get their come to Jesus moment until the empire is not as strong as it is. And then they'll realize that they've got to fix it. But I think in the short term, though, what will happen is institution by institution will probably do something like George Evanston, Georgetown University, other universities are doing this, other cities are doing this, realizing what they did. I think California is on board reparations. Chicago police, you believe that? Chicago police even rewarded reparations. And I think that is the short term. Reparations will be awarded short term where proof is so fierce and obvious that they will do that. Over time, I think some economic restitution from the United States will come long term, but only after the United States probably is not what it is now, where they feel like we don't have to do that. Not like in post-Nazi Germany where they felt like they had to do something, and they have tried to change their society in a very, very fundamental way. Unlike here, where this should have happened after slavery. Everybody knows that they should have had hearings on reparations after slavery, not in 2067, which looks like when we'll get them. But I'll keep that short, so give everybody the last 5 minutes so they can answer.
Yeah, I mean, that's an overwhelming, I think that
Mhm.
the abyss I was talking about, I think is so overwhelming and deep and pervasive that the only way to bridge it is for all of them to be working and for all of us to be trying to work on all three of them at the same time in every other way we can. I mean, there is progress on reparations, thank goodness, in Evanston, and like, I'm sure y'all remember even when Hillary Clinton and even Barack Obama didn't even talk about reparations back then. It wasn't something that people spoke out loud about. And now at least there's conversation. Tragically, the polls show that the 2/3 of Americans are against it, but I think a big reason for that is the lack of understanding that I was referring to.
Mhm.
I mean, people here in this room, like Cynthia and Melanie, and Ron, have heard me say this many times before, but one of my favorite quotes from James Baldwin is, if you don't know what happened behind you, you've got no idea what's going on around you. And I think most people have no idea what really happened behind them and the effect that it has ongoing. So that's the first step is increase that awareness, then work on the macro ideas, the brilliant work that you've done and reparations, while also trying every day to do little teeny things. I mean, I feel like I have the easy and most selfish job. I just get to help people every day and make them happy and make a little bit of an incremental change. But if we don't do all of that every day, we're not gonna overcome this situation.
This is such an excellent question and a great way to summarize our panel. If I were to guess which bucket would be more successful, I would argue incentivizing entrepreneurship would probably be most successful because it fits within our capitalist model of, right, put the burden on individuals to start their own businesses. So I would imagine that would be the most successful. However, I agree with you in that I think we need to be working on all three buckets, and each bucket could help the other in ways that perhaps we're not thinking about. So a transparency framework for the private sector, for example, could help significantly with the conversation surrounding reparations, right? Because if you have a framework that obligates companies to disclose past racial injustices, that could be used to assist in kind of calculating the level of reparations that are owed. I think, gosh, I had other thoughts, but I can't fully remember. But yeah, just the whole notion of each bucket kind of helping the other, I think is really, really, really important. I also believe in, right, not necessarily worrying about political backlash, right? I think it's important to kind of build our frameworks now and kind of wait for that window of opportunity. You had mentioned, right, the fact that there are parties that are continually, like they're benefiting, like they're profiting from this sort of vicious cycle. Part of what I'm trying to argue, perhaps after 40 pages of reading, everyone kind of gives up. But I think this is actually self-destructive, right? I think this cycle is self-destructive for most of us. And I think there's actually a really small percentage of elite individuals and institutions that are benefiting. But I think the political messaging is quite deceptive and manipulative. So if we could see the ways in which these cycles hurt us all, am I hopeful? I have a sliver of optimism, but these battles are difficult.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we have entrepreneurship, we have oversight and transparency, and we have reparations, redistribution, going from different levels of aggression and different levels of aspiration and different levels of hope for ultimate change in our economy. So thank you for giving us these ideas, and I think we're out of time. So thank you for a wonderful panel, and feel free to come up and ask the panelists more questions afterwards. Thank you.